now the folks will start joining. Hey everyone that's joined so far. We'll just give another couple of minutes here for people to log on. But thanks so much for being here. We're really excited to have Courtney here. Looks like we're slowing down on people that are joining, but I'll give it just another minute. Got lots of folks joining from all over, just so exciting. Oregon, Wisconsin, all time zones, pretty cool. All right, I'm gonna get started. So again, thank you so much for being here. We're really excited for this webinar, and it seems to be a topic that a ton of people are interested in and that we want to start having conversations about. My name is Gina. I'm the program coordinator for the Climate Literacy and Energy Awareness Network at the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences at University of Colorado Boulder. And today we have Dr. Courtney Welton-Mitchell, who's going to be speaking about climate change and mental health, as you know. In terms of housekeeping, the session is being recorded, so you'll be able to access it again afterwards. We will have a presentation and time for questions at the end, but feel free to type questions into the chat as we're going along. And if you have any technical difficulties, you can message me directly. My username right now is Clean. And feel free to raise your hand at the end as well. And we can, Alicia and I will be monitoring the chat as we go in the Q&A. But yeah, feel free to put questions in the chat and definitely stay engaged, and we're so excited. So I will pass it over to Dr. Welton-Mitchell.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with this group today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, I think everyone can see those slides.
Looks good.
Okay, great. So just a little bit about myself before I get started with the content today, and also to let you know, you can drop comments and questions in the chat. And I've told Alicia and Gina, please feel free to interject and interrupt if there's something that we'd like to discuss as I'm going along. I'll also have time at the end for questions and for a little bit of discussion and resource sharing. So my name's Courtney Welton-Mitchell. I actually work over at the Colorado School of Public Health, where I'm the director of the Climate and Disaster Resilience Certificate in the Environmental and Occupational Health Department. My background, in addition to my current work, is primarily as an educator and as a researcher doing disaster mental health research domestically and internationally. But my background is also as a practicing mental health clinician. So for many years, I worked as a mental health clinician primarily with survivors of traumatic stress and disaster events. So I really come to this content from a few different perspectives. And this is a topic that I really love engaging around. So you have my contact information here. You're welcome to reach out to me after the webinar has concluded as well. And also feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about the Climate and Disaster Resilience Certificate at the Colorado School of Public Health. So today we'll talk about climate and mental health, acknowledging grief and inspiring hope. So I just want to clarify how we're going to go through the content up front here. So the objectives are that we're going to understand the state of the evidence generally. We'll do kind of a fast, quick tour through that. Understand the state of the evidence concerning climate change and mental health. We'll learn how to process personal grief and loss related to climate change and how to support students experiencing grief and loss related to climate change, as well as touch on traumatic stress associated with disasters. And we'll also learn how to inspire hope in yourself and students through examples of innovation, advocacy, and community action. Also, one additional aside about myself, I'm the mother of a precocious fifth grader who is very interested in this topic as well. So I try to keep her in mind as well when I'm thinking about, for example, developmentally appropriate content around climate, grief, and hope. So additionally, when we structured this 1-hour webinar, we thought about, it's a little difficult to have it be very interactive in a webinar format, but we did want to leave time at the back end again for discussion and some Q&A. So we'll go quickly through the research, look at some coping skills, moving from kind of a grief to a hope perspective, and emphasizing some aspects again of the innovation, advocacy, and community action, but leaving time at the end. So let me go ahead and minimize this box here on my screen. I want to take you to some of the literature. So you can basically do a search for climate change and mental health research, and you can come up with lots of studies, lots of scoping reviews, evidence reviews, a number of associated reports. And what you'll see as you look through these documents that are, very easily available to you, including things that are not behind a paywall and journals. So there's lots of publicly available free resources around this. You'll find in some of the things that I've highlighted here that climate change has been associated with mental health in terms of linked to feelings of helplessness, hopelessness, anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, substance abuse, a sense of loss, grief, a lack of interest in future planning, a feeling of hopelessness about the future. And we have resources that suggest that there is a path forward to address some of this and mitigate the impacts. So that's part of what we'll look at today. Now, I do have separate data that I'm not including here on, for example, what is the percentage of people exposed to certain types of climate-related disasters that typically go on to develop PTSD and things of that nature. As a rough estimate, we see like high exposed populations, about 30% in a disaster may go on to develop symptoms of PTSD, but that's not primarily the focus of what I'll be covering today. I'm more looking at this sort of constellation of adverse mental health impacts that we know to be associated with climate and disasters. So one of the things that I want to unpack a little bit as I sort of build for you a model of what are the pathways linking climate change and mental health outcomes is looking at some things that may be less well known. So when we think about climate and mental health, I think perhaps many of us think about disaster mental health and disaster events impacting mental health. But when we think about climate mental health, we also need to consider, for example, climate impacts on air and water pollution. And we do have research that suggests that aspects of air and water pollution are linked to adverse mental health outcomes. Furthermore, we know that climate impacts, as with the impacts of disasters, these are not spread evenly across all contexts and populations. People that are already disadvantaged in many ways are disproportionately impacted by climate change. So we think about climate justice frameworks and really trying to address issues around race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, putting people in harm's way, putting people in a situation where they're more likely to be exposed to, for example, environmental toxins, as well as to various types of disasters and the accompanying mental health impacts of that exposure. At the same time, we think about people with pre-existing mental health conditions are actually at greater risk when they are subsequently exposed to environmental toxins and disasters. So over on the right-hand side, I have this position statement from the American Psychiatric Association that just underscores some of what I've said. I think it's important to think about the sort of multiple ways that climate and mental health are linked. So unpacking some of that, again, we have a climate justice perspective where we know there's disproportionate impact on some groups. And we also know that climate change is driving extreme weather events. So this includes storms, flooding, landslides, drought, wildfires. And so we have the specific and direct mental health impacts of disasters. Climate change is also increasing environmental toxins, air, water, various kinds of pollution that can have impacts on mental health. And that includes impacts on developmental pathways through which early childhood exposure can result in, in some cases fairly immediate, but in other cases quite delayed longer term mental health impacts. We also see climate change increasing displacement. So there's lots of ways in which climate change is associated with displacement. Here's a few examples. We think about sea level rise in coastal communities. We think about civil conflicts over resources driving or dwindling resources driving that displacement. And there are a myriad of impacts of displacement on mental health. Displacement puts people at risk for a variety of mental health concerns as well as broader health concerns. We also know that climate change has impacts on livelihoods. So for example, subsistence farming communities and drought, those same communities and unpredictable rainfall patterns, diminishing crop yields, mental health impacts of lost livelihoods. And then finally, as some of you are probably aware, we have kind of an emerging vocabulary around specific types of climate change concerns. So climate-specific mental health symptoms, for example, eco-anxiety, eco-depression. And again, this maps broadly onto feelings of hopelessness, cynicism, or an existential crisis about the future. So when, for example, I open my email, like today, I open my email and this is associated with a newsletter that I get. Immediately I see hail, fire, and drought. Colorado behind only Kansas in spike of major disasters in past 20 years. So whether you're going looking for this information or not, we are increasingly, all of us, exposed to essentially what's very disturbing news, right? So we have news about disasters. We have reports coming out on climate change. You know, this one highlights, for example, US climate impacts, future severity. Some of this is based on predictive models looking at severity dependent on choices we make today. And then we see, are we making those choices to mitigate impacts? Maybe we're not making those choices. So it's easy to feel despondent. It's easy to feel overwhelmed. One of the things that is important is I know it is tempting to move directly to feeling hopeful and to focusing on what can be done. But I would encourage us all, both from the perspective of our own needs, as well as from the perspective of working with others, including students of various ages and developmental levels. I would encourage us all to try to sit with the intensity, the grief, and the loss, and acknowledge that before immediately moving on to a space of hope and innovation. I think sometimes we can inadvertently make people feel invalidated if we're not allowing people to be sad and upset. So some of you may be familiar, there's lots of models. This is just one, the Kubler-Ross grief cycle. So when people are grieving, often, for example, you might be grieving a loss of a loved one. There's lots of different ways and forms of grief and reasons that we might be grieving. There's a cycle that is, it varies by individual, so it's not prescriptive or linear, but it might include denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then eventually acceptance. So the reason that I highlight this is because if we try to take someone who's grieving and we move them immediately to acceptance, then we've skipped over all this other component of grief that is a natural part of the grieving process. And when we all begin to immerse ourselves in the process of fully understanding climate change impacts and implications, and the associated global landscape around worsening disasters, for example, then we can feel despondent and overwhelmed. And it's tempting to want to move ourselves and others immediately out of that space of grief and loss. But I would say that we all need to go through that process in order to move to a space where we can be hopeful and generative and move forward. So in yourself and in your students, I would say anticipate some of this grief and loss and validate those feelings of grief and loss before moving on. Another thing that you might find interesting, I certainly find it interesting. This is not to say that anger is always a helpful emotion. Anger can be problematic and destructive depending on the behaviors associated with anger. But this is an article that I highlight, and we've seen this pattern, elsewhere outside of this one article in one research context, where anger can be a motivator. So we have this graphic on the right-hand side. Anger can be good if it's an energy that motivates you towards action to right the thing that is angering you. So this research, interestingly, looked at eco-anger, and you can read the journal article if you're interested and understand more about how they define these terms. They looked at eco-anger, eco-anxiety, and eco-depression. And those experiencing eco-anger had better mental health outcomes, and they were also likely to be more engaged in pro-climate activism and in personal behaviors designed to mitigate adverse climate outcomes. The eco-anxiety and the eco-depression were less adaptive and were associated with adverse mental health outcomes and lower well-being scores. So that's also interesting to think about, is not just kind of holding a space for and supporting yourself and your students around the grief and loss and the sadness, but thinking about how sometimes anger can be a motivator and a catalyst for change, and it can actually have potentially positive associations with mental health if it's channeled appropriately. So moving, and I'm just checking to see if there's any chat or questions or concerns at this point. No, it looks like there's a few things in chat, but again, Alicia and Gina, feel free to jump in and speak over me if there's something urgent, and otherwise we will have time for questions at the end. So I want to address an issue that has come up in the past. So some time ago, I did a webinar, and that was a webinar focused on child disaster mental health. So it was kind of an introduction to the topic. And that was a webinar for teachers where they had requested, can you please give me some information, because I'm concerned about teaching about potentially traumatic topics in the classroom, and I don't know if the children I'm teaching have been exposed to disasters or how they will respond. And I'm concerned about that. I'm concerned about the implications. I'm concerned that I don't have necessarily the skills or the confidence to kind of open up a Pandora's box about certain topics and not be able to address the emotional responses that some children may have. So it's true, some children may have, and probably we can just say will have, some children in your classroom will have experienced natural hazards and disasters or other types of potentially traumatic events. and that might make it difficult for them to engage with climate and disaster content. However, there's a few ways that we can look at addressing this. One is to work with the school leadership, social workers, counselors, wellness coaches, and others to let children and families know what to expect in advance. For example, if you are teaching a curriculum on climate and disasters over the course of a few weeks, and address any fears or concerns. So giving them that knowledge and awareness up front so they're not taken by surprise. Additionally, I would say we don't want to be paternalistic, particularly with older children, but even in a developmentally appropriate way with younger children. We want to give children a sense of agency and choice about content that they can engage with and whether or not they feel emotionally able to handle the content. So, for example, I'm thinking of a young girl in my daughter's class some years ago. They were first or second grade, who had had a very terrifying experience with a tornado and became very upset every time it rained. And, had the adults around her decided that, she didn't get to engage with certain content because they were worried about her, I think that would have been a very different strategy than talking to her and asking her if she would like to engage with certain content, giving her an opportunity to take breaks or disengage or skip things as needed. So I would just say, it depends on the individual, it depends on the circumstance, but more often than not, providing a sense of agency and choice, including for young and for older children, is really important when covering difficult topics, rather than just excluding them based on what you think is best for them. Part of that is also about focusing on efficacy, empowerment. Children that have a history of exposure to disasters and other types of traumatic stress can actually find it therapeutic to engage with content around how to, say, prepare for disasters, how to mitigate disasters, climate action and efficacy. So focusing on the value of climate action and disaster preparedness can be therapeutic, beneficial, it can make students feel capable and safe. At the same time, we want to think about encouraging their preferred coping skills. I'll talk a little bit in a minute about preferred coping skills instead of just assuming we all have the same coping skills that work for each of us. So preferred coping skills, using coping games or exercises, anticipating, acknowledging, and managing any feelings of fear, anxiety, sadness, anger, apathy, hopelessness, again, validating those feelings and not forcing students to move away from those feelings immediately, role modeling, and perhaps sharing that this is difficult for adults as well. So another way of thinking about how to handle a situation where you might be covering curriculum around climate and disasters, and you might have children that you're concerned about in your classroom exposed to that curriculum, is having a referral sort of pathway or referral resources available. So if any students are becoming distressed or feeling overwhelmed, for example, in learning about climate change and climate impacts, for example, you might have a child who's feeling highly anxious after that, provide immediate school-based resources and then consider, again, maybe with the school social worker and or the parents and the child, optional levels of participation and engagement. So you could work with the social workers and mental health specialists and consider referrals for services and supports that might be school-based or community-based. So here is a graphic just to give you an idea about the extent to which we have like these laundry lists. You can find these in lots of places, these long laundry lists of different coping skills. What are coping skills? They're basically just something that enables us to feel emotionally regulated when we feel dysregulated, when we feel anxious or overwhelmed. So when we're exposed to content that is difficult, sometimes it's helpful to walk ourselves and students through a process of identifying, what can we do to cope with difficult content. So there's some things that, of course, you can do at home or children and students can do at home. So we can think about coping skills as sort of this broader constellation of things that we can do when we're feeling overwhelmed or anxious. For example, if we turn on the news or in some other way we are exposed to something about climate or disasters, then that's something that we know that we have a tool basket of coping skills and we can engage those coping skills. But another thing we might think about is, what can we do in the classroom? So is there something, for example, when you're teaching this curriculum or before you're teaching the curriculum or after you're teaching the curriculum, movement breaks, jokes, coming up with, as we're going to talk about in a minute, action projects and ways to channel energy towards an innovative and hopeful direction. So when we think about preferred coping skills, before I move off the slide, I just want to say that one thing I would discourage you from doing is asking all the students in your class to do the same thing. Like, now we're all going to do a journal exercise, or now we're all going to do a breathing exercise or whatnot. What tends to work best is to say, hey, I'm going to give you 3 choices. Which of these things would you prefer to do? Because we have people that love journaling to cope with stress, and we have people that hate it. So for example, if I ever introduce it in a mental health workshop working with adults, and I say, now we're going to do a journal exercise, I see some faces in the room brighten and other people almost audibly groan. So just keep in mind that whether children or adults, we tend to like a basket of choices when it comes to coping exercises. But if you approach it from that perspective, I think you could also build in different coping activities into your course curriculum while you're teaching about climate and disasters. So I just want to say a little bit about the human tendency to avoid difficult topics. So I have been involved in a lot of disaster preparedness trainings, and I know it also comes up in those trainings. It also comes up in like messaging campaigns about climate mitigation or disaster preparedness messaging campaigns. How do we get people to engage? So people, this is a nice quote, I'll just read it out on the slide. While the vast majority of people claim to be concerned about the climate, it's also the case that large numbers of people avoid, minimize, switch off, or distance themselves from effectively engaging with problems and challenging content. So what I would suggest is that we just acknowledge that and take a minute to think about what our strategy is for encouraging people to engage when we know the sort of default for a lot of us is really disengagement. This book on the right is also useful. Don't even think about it, why our brains are wired to ignore climate change. So if we want people to engage, I would argue, and this is consistent with what we know from the research, we have to offer something more than doom and gloom. Yes, we have to be truthful. We have to provide students with real information, and we have to acknowledge the grief and loss and the challenges associated with them digesting that information. But at the same time, if the message they get from that process is, climate change impacts are a foregone conclusion, then we're going to disengage. Adults, students, whomever we are, we're going to disengage if we feel like there's no path forward. So we have to emphasize that we can do something, and we have to then say, here's exactly what you can do. We have to give some ideas and opportunities for students to do something immediately that doesn't feel overwhelming and challenging, but feels like they can sort of bite off little manageable chunks and really engage. And then at the same time, integrating, as I mentioned, the coping skills. We might include the exercises and fun games to encourage people to be open to receiving difficult information. Because otherwise, sometimes what happens is people are receiving difficult information and a few minutes in, they just shut down. So you might have a student looking at you, but they're not really present. They're not really engaged in processing information because they're feeling overwhelmed. So here's a few ideas as I would like to start to pivot towards a more optimistic framework. So Phil, and this is again for your own mental health and well-being, as well as for essentially the resources you would need to teach about climate and disasters and things that you could also mirror with your students. So one suggestion would be to subscribe to the Climate Optimist. I don't know if you are familiar with the Climate Optimist. I've provided lots of links to Alicia and Gina, and they can share these links with you. And one of these links includes the Climate Optimist. You can subscribe to the newsletter. You can access lots of resources from the Climate Optimist. Basically, as the tagline says, it's your monthly dose of good news about climate change. So what does that mean, good news about climate change? It's things like understanding that hope is essential for inspiring climate action, that hope is justified, that there are a lot of exciting things that are happening and there's reason for hope. This is also a website where you can find information to kind of help you counteract the climate doom narratives or feeling completely overwhelmed or despondent around that. Also ways of thinking about how hope is good for our health generally, health broadly, as well as mental health specifically. The strategies for driving hope is from, on the right-hand side of the slide, is from an article, Hope, Health, and the Climate Crisis by Dr. Howard Frumkin. And this is all linked to the Climate Optimist. And I'll also, on the next slide, provide you with a direct link to that article. So if you want to access this article. As this graphic on the last slide does, I am going to summarize the article for you, just to kind of give you an idea, again, if you want to access the article and dive in a bit deeper. So what we know is that hope and hopelessness both have clear implications for health and mental health. We also know that there are proven strategies for propelling and encouraging hope. So here are a few that are highlighted in the article. One is that we need to tell the truth, including to students, be open and honest in our communication. They can often tell if we're not being open and honest and if we're withholding information, as can adults, including being honest about what we don't know, about tolerating ambiguity, and really positioning ourselves as a role model for how to engage with challenging topics and how to tolerate ambiguity and how to be honest in our communication. Again, as I said, not rushing people through the grief, but acknowledging grief. I like this quote, this is from the article, denying the despair creates a barrier to acknowledging upsetting information. It undermines confidence in confronting it and triggers emotional withdrawal. Acknowledging the pain brings a sense of relief, hope, and increased determination and capacity to act. We also want to envision success, identify pathways to success, and empower people to act. So this is really breaking things down into concrete, manageable chunks and saying, here's how we're going to move forward. Cultivating solidarity, so encouraging social connection. I have another slide about that where we can see lots of opportunities for social connection around climate activism, for example, and making room for joy. So there are other resources that we can think about. For example, we know that when we look at health messaging, so there's a broader research literature on health messaging. So when we look at health messaging, if we focus on the losses, it's harder to motivate people to change behaviors. If we focus on the gains, so it's like a gain versus loss framework. If we focus on the gains, then people are more likely to want to engage and want to change their behaviors. So for example, here's this report that I also have provided the links to. You can download this for free on the medical promise of climate solutions. And this is really looking at the health benefits of climate action around clean energy, transportation, home and community, and food. So this is saying, hey, with a bit of change, we can have all these positive health impacts, instead of saying, if we don't change, our lifespan will decrease, right? So it's like the sort of doom and gloom loss perspective versus the, hey, if we change, here are the benefits, here are the gains. And then when we think about inspiring hope, it's really about, I walk a fine line because I don't want to suggest that older generations, myself included, are not culpable and responsible. We are. So I'm not suggesting that we shift the entire burden of mitigating climate change to our youth. But there's a lot of exciting things happening at the level of youth activism. So I think when we're working with students, to the extent that they can see themselves reflected in young adults, it is really hopeful and inspiring. So, you can do a quick search, internet search, and I've highlighted just a few things that pop up, 14 innovations led by young ecopreneurs that are protecting and restoring our planet. Around the world, young people are driving climate innovation, Youth in Action, United Nations forums. We also have thinking about inspiring hope and advocacy around, whether it's youth that are climate activists that are highly visible, or youth that are spearheading a variety of different innovative and exciting and fun Earth Day activities and events. And we can also think about community action. So one of the things that I would like to have you all think about, and including, myself as an educator in this domain, is thinking about, so on the left-hand side of the slide, we have a headline like, we have 12 years to limit climate change catastrophe, warns UN. Urgent changes needed to cut risk of extreme heat, drought, floods, and poverty, right? But then there's immediately a link that was embedded at the top of that article that said, overwhelmed by climate change, here's what you can do. And when you click on that link, on the right-hand side, this is kind of the lead image for what is an article that highlights like 14 different ways that youth are engaged, kind of alluding to that previous article, and all the ways in which youth are engaged in innovative activities and what you can do to be involved as well. So we need to provide real information, but we need to at the same time say, hey, here's ways that we can acknowledge the feelings of overwhelm and pivot to activism and channel that energy. And in some cases, as I mentioned, we're channeling anger. People are feeling, say, a self-righteous anger. So there's lots going on with youth and the climate movement. 350.org is just one of many opportunities to engage with global grassroots activism in terms of the climate crisis. One of the things, and then if you see on the right, the Earth Month Spotlight, Building Solidarity Across Oceans with the Pacific Climate Warriors. So there are all these really cool initiatives, right? And one of the things that I want to highlight is it's not just about collective action to address climate change. Collective action as opposed to individual action, collective action can be very helpful in addressing climate change. It can be an effective strategy, but from a mental health perspective, the most important driver of mental health and well-being is a social network and social support, positive peer relationships. That includes as well a positive sense of purpose and meaning, a productive outlet to channel our energy, offsetting cynicism and hopelessness. So if you can encourage youth to be involved in initiatives together and facilitate and foster that collective sense of purpose and activism and social support, then that's fantastic, because we know that that kind of social support and engagement is absolutely associated with mental health and well-being and can offset some of the negative implications of learning about climate change, which is frankly, an exercise in grief and loss. So how to move through that process. The other thing
Hey, Courtney.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, we had a question in the chat and one question in the Q&A.
Okay.
The question in the chat was a few slides back, but Jason was asking, how do you define a gloom and doom framework, and how many teachers are teaching about climate change and leaving students with, well, there's nothing we can do? Kind of a
yeah. So thank you for interjecting. So that is a great point. So when I say like a gloom and doom framework, I mean, if we think about a narrative arc almost with climate change, what I would recommend is that we tell the truth. We encourage ourselves and students to engage in the difficulties associated with the truth. We acknowledge the grief, the loss, the existential crisis, the feelings of overwhelm. And then we say, okay, there are also ways in which we can mitigate climate change. We can actually intervene. And let's talk about the process of doing something meaningful to intervene and what the potential benefits are of that. So when I talked about that gain versus loss framework, it's instead of saying, well, it won't be so bad and the losses won't be so extensive if we just change our behavior. Instead, say, hey, we have the potential for all these positive outcomes if we do change our behavior, like that report on positive health outcomes that are associated with various types of behavior change linked to climate action, right? So I don't think anyone's necessarily making a mistake in that they haven't kind of thought about this in a narrative arc and pivoted to the process of, a gain-based, what can we do? How can we engage in climate action and instill a sense of hope? But I think it's just something we need to remind ourselves. And again, I remind myself as an educator that not only is it difficult to get anyone to engage in any kind of behavior change if they feel overwhelmed. They're going to tune us out. They're going to be less likely to change their behaviors. They're going to be overwhelmed. So not only is it just not useful, but then it's also potentially emotionally challenging, and it's creating a situation where we could be taking it one step further and saying, hey, I recognize that this is heavy and this is difficult, but let's talk about what we're going to do collectively to move forward and inspire climate action and hope and innovation. And so that's where I don't know, I hope that addresses the question. That's where I don't want to, sort of blame any of us, myself included, for, I have lots of lectures that probably somebody would look at and say, boy, that's a real doom and gloom climate lecture where I just talk about one challenge after the other and one negative impact after the other, and I don't sort of pivot to climate action and hope. So I guess that's really what I'm hoping is that we could collectively, commit to trying to do when we're teaching about this content. So part of that is related to this particular slide, which is about resilience, right? So if we think about resilience, then we can think about climate resilience as the ability to acknowledge, anticipate, prepare for, respond to climate-related challenges so that we can better cope with the risk. And disaster resilience, similarly, learning from past disasters, reducing risk to future disasters. So we're moving to a position where we can talk about resilience with communities, with students, as a collective way to strengthen our ability to move towards a more hopeful future. So there are lots of examples of this, but if you look up youth climate action webinar, I mean, there's just tons of resources that come up. So again, the youth, and that's, children, teenagers, into early adulthood, and this kind of under the umbrella of youth, they're really taking the lead on some of the resilience and innovation work happening. And I think, we're seeing, of course, with like the Clean Network and others, lots of resources around how can we educate students around climate and disasters in a way that is useful, informative, and finally, perhaps not, something we associate with climate change, but inspiring and hopeful, right? So climate action and activism and climate justice, these are all positive frameworks that tend to really galvanize people. And that means galvanize youth as well as galvanize adults. So if we can talk in those terms and really teach in those terms and think about how to inspire our students to be, increasingly the innovative generation that addresses these issues head on, then I feel like that's going to be what's going to get us all through. And that's what's going to enable our students to feel like they in fact actively seek out opportunities to engage with this content instead of avoiding and shutting down when this content comes up. So I'm aware of the time, and we have like 15 minutes to the hour. One of the things that I was hoping is to turn it over to all of you participating in the webinar, as well as Alicia and Gina, to talk a little bit about resources and strategies. So something that you think is useful in acknowledging grief and moving towards hope and action, climate action, that maybe has been useful for you or for your students. And I know also with Clean and other associated resources, We have, I believe, coming by June 1st, a whole build out of web pages on climate change and mental health. So maybe Alicia could talk about that a little bit as well. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. And thank you so much for your attention. And apologies that I'm talking at you, because I really hope that we can take the last remaining time to have a chat. And I'm happy to share these slides.
Thank you so much, Courtney. Yes, and as Courtney mentioned, very soon we will have some web pages up really around strategies that can help combat challenges with mental health and climate change. And we'll cover a lot of actually what Courtney covered today too. So you can also find, if you do a search just for climate action or action in the CLEAN web pages, you'll come up with a whole bunch of resources that include climate action. There's also resources in there that talk about climate activists. And the web pages that we will provide too are going to have links to a variety of different resources. It's going to be kind of like what else is in our collection in terms of just lots of resources. It's going to be a link to a whole bunch of resources that are out there to help you as you work through some of these emotions yourself, as you work with your students as well. And then I think we also had another question, right, in the chat, Gina?
There's a question in the Q&A that is a little bit longer, but it's a great point. Rebecca says this might be a controversial take, but she believes it could be a bigger and more systemic issue, because when our knowledge of bad things like climate change kind of overpowers our power to change these things, it can be a recipe for existential despair. And sometimes actions like journaling and movement breaks can't overcome that. She mentioned her daughter has a friend who died by suicide in January at age 19, following this friend's deep dive into climate and social justice activism, and then despair accordingly. So she, as a result, is reducing her and her children's information exposure, and is saying that for as long as humans have existed, we've only had knowledge and information in our circles of influence, and maybe this information overload that we're experiencing is really overpowering for us, and we are having a hard time overcoming that. So she was just asking what your thoughts are on that, and if you think that that's related or something we can overcome.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Rebecca. So I think this is a really important and powerful point, and sort of connects to one thing that maybe I'm remiss in not having covered in my slides, and that's there's something called secondary traumatic stress and vicarious trauma, and that there's a variety of ways that we can be exposed to and acquire secondary traumatic stress or vicarious trauma, and one is through the media. So I think it's incredibly important to limit our media consumption. And this is something, I covered in other contexts and other topics, for example, the beginning of the pandemic, right? So we, had people that were just really dramatically increasing their exposure to media early in the pandemic in hopes of better understanding or feeling a sense of control or feeling like there was something that they could do. But in fact, many times people felt overwhelmed and helpless. And we saw research coming out where there was a direct relationship between media consumption and adverse mental health outcomes. So limiting media exposure, I think, is really important. Making sure when you think about the constellation of how you spend your time and the hours in your day, thinking about what proportion of it is dedicated to joyful activities and social connections versus maybe addressing things that are more challenging. When I put together this presentation today, perhaps inaccurately, but in my mind, I sort of pictured that some of the people in the webinar would be people who are wondering how to teach content and curriculum that is about climate and disaster. And so I'm imagining if you're a teacher in the classroom and you're being told, or even if you're spearheading the curriculum, that you are going to need to cover this content, how do you cover this content in a sensitive and meaningful way that acknowledges grief and inspires hope and climate action? But if you're a parent, for example, and you're at home with your children, as I'm the parent to a fifth grader, I would not allow my daughter to, spend 4 hours watching back-to-back climate documentaries that weren't associated with any kind of, kind of more hopeful framework. And I do think that children, for example, as to Rebecca's point, children that are already struggling with mental health issues, we need to think thoughtfully about how to support them in engaging with this kind of material. Again, instilling a sense of choice and agency, but noting that it could be especially overwhelming if they're in a vulnerable emotional state. So I very much appreciate and acknowledge Rebecca's point, and I'm very sorry to hear about this loss. I mean, it's just devastating.
Courtney, related to kind of what you've just been talking about, there's another question in terms of how do we help students have conversations with their parents or older adults? Not all youth are old enough to vote, but they can influence people around them, is the comment. I'm going to put a link to actually a clean resource in the chat that you can go to that actually helps work through helping students talk with adults about this, but also love to hear your thoughts, Courtney.
That's great. Thank you for putting that resource in the chat. So I've actually looked at probably that resource that you're about to share, as well as some others. And one of the things that I think is pretty consistent with the available resources, as well as with the research, is that it's very difficult to change anyone's mind. And when you come at them directly with a challenge to core belief systems, sometimes all that does is provoke and exacerbate a conflict. So there are some other ways that you might, for example, as a child, share with adults in your life, regardless of their values or belief systems, what you're learning in school. For example, people are likely to be much more receptive to like a specific project that you're engaging with that is focused on a particular solution, as opposed to an argument about the legitimacy of, interpretive frameworks about climate change. So I don't know, is that consistent with some of the resources that you're sharing, Alicia?
I believe so, yes.
Because I do think we need to equip students to have those conversations, but in a way that enables them to engage with adults, in a manner that's a little psychologically safer for them.
I'm curious, does that apply for adults as well?
There are lots of books written on strategies for having difficult conversations, whether it's across a political divide or other kinds of a divide in values. And yes, absolutely, for adults, anyone that we want to engage with, if we come at them directly with an assault on their core beliefs and values, they're likely to shut down, and there's not really anything that we're saying after that point that they're processing or digesting. So there's some strategies that are out there in various, books and resources around having difficult conversations with people across a value divide, so that you can maybe come to a space where you are both more receptive and open to dialogue. So yes, adults too.
We have a couple more questions. A great one that we'll get to in a second that is kind of near and dear to my heart about kind of age appropriateness. But Gina, I believe you said there was a question back in the Q&A from a bit ago.
Yeah, someone is asking about resources, and maybe Alicia or Courtney or even Reb from Action for Climate Emergency, who's doing similar work, might have ideas about this, but they're asking, in promoting climate resilience in communities, Do you have toolkits readily available to help programs develop, refine, and implement workshops for specific communities to help in disaster or climate preparedness? Are there workshops or programs or projects that could include for training climate scientists or educators, student professional development, scientific researchers, community engagement, etc.? So it sounds like resources for programs to help in disaster climate preparedness in the form of workshops or something like that.
I don't know, Alicia, if you want to speak to that. What I was hoping too is that I'm trying to look through the chat here as well, is that, you know, I imagine the people on this call are coming from so many different vantage points and experiences that they have a wealth of resources to share. And I'm sorry that the webinar format doesn't really lend itself to, you know, ease of sharing as well, but hopefully we can have some people, I see some of the things people are already pasting in the chat here that are fantastic resources that we could then share with the people that registered for the webinar. And I know that CLEAN and other networks are really doing a lot of work around building out resources. And then you of course have, whether it's Red Cross or FEMA or others that are offering free disaster preparedness trainings. Those are being offered through workplaces as well. And increasingly, we're having that conversation not only about disaster preparedness, but about climate mitigation and adaptation as well.
Great, and there will be a few resources around disaster preparedness in the websites that are coming out here in the next month, hopefully. There's a question in the chat just about kind of the how to address developmental appropriateness in culturally responsive ways, and you know what is appropriate for like those early learners. One thing I'll mention is, and I'll put this in the chat, is to check out our elementary strategies CLEAN pages, because that actually addresses some of your question here. And then I'd like to hear what Courtney has to say about this.
I mean, I think, you know, there are lots of good resources being shared. I would just say, just like anything else, you know, I think that arc is still going to be the same that I suggested, right? Where we're telling the truth, we're validating difficult feelings of grief and loss, we're pivoting to a more hopeful, action-oriented perspective that includes social connection and solidarity and gain-framed possibilities for a more hopeful future. And I think if we think about what that looks like for a 12th grader or a 6th grader or a 1st grader, that looks very different in terms of how we would do that and what the curriculum would be and the level of detail and complexity. But I would suggest that, you know, while we would modify the content developmentally, that arc could happen at, you know, even at the level of preschool or 1st grade. There's, you know, a very simplified version that you could do.
Mm-hmm. And I think the thing to remember too is that, I mean, kids are hearing about this, whether you're talking about it with them or not. They're going to hear about it from family, from friends, from the media, everywhere. And so it's better to have the conversation and talk to them about it than to ignore it. Okay, I think I love Rebecca had just put a question there for the other teachers that are still on the call out there. If you're interested in answering her, if you deliberately adapt your teaching to make climate change less scary to your students, we'd love to hear from you. So we'll stay on for a couple minutes here, but it is 5 o'clock here in Mountain Standard Time. And so I do want to acknowledge the time and thank Courtney so much for being available for us today. And Gina, do you have anything you would like to add?
Just want to thank Courtney again and say that we do have an amazing collection of over 850 resources on our website here, cleannet.org, and I encourage you to check it out. We I'm also going to put our email in the chat, clean@colorado.edu. If you have any questions or want to follow up with anything, feel free to email us. And just want to thank Courtney again for being so amazing. And this is really super pertinent and super helpful information. So thank you.
Thank you. And again, I'm so just impressed with everything in the chat happening right now. So I appreciate you leaving the webinar open for a few minutes so we can capture some of that in the chat. And I'm sorry that I can't, engage individually with and see some of the people responding in the chat, but feel free to be in touch with me, and I'm happy to be a resource. Thank you. It's an honor and a privilege to be a resource for this today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. Like I said, this has been a recorded session. So you'll be able to find that on our YouTube channel and on our site. So keep your eyes open for that. So thank you. Thanks, Courtney.